I am Vanessa, 33 years old and standing in the center of what was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. Instead of flowers and music, I was staring at 300 empty mahogany chairs and a florist aggressively ripping white roses out of their tall crystal displays. My phone buzzed in my cold hand with a message from my father. "Come home immediately. No daughter of mine marries without my permission." I did not cry. I simply took a deep breath and prepared to burn my toxic family tree to the ground. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family members who tried to control your life and underestimate your worth. The morning fog had barely lifted off the pristine lawns of the Botanical Gardens when Gavin and I arrived at 8 o'clock sharp. As a public defender, Gavin was used to walking into chaotic situations, but the utter silence of the grand pavilion caught us both off guard. The string quartet was supposed to be setting up in the gazebo. The catering trucks should have been unloading crates of champagne and hors d'oeuvres. Instead, there was nothing but the crunch of our shoes on the white gravel path. I tightened my grip on Gavin's arm as we walked toward the main reception tent. That was when I saw Maria, the lead florist, violently throwing handfuls of expensive white hydrangeas into the back of her delivery van. When Maria saw me, her face went completely pale. She dropped a bundle of eucalyptus and rushed over, wiping her hands on her apron. She asked me what I was doing here and why I was dressed in my bridal gown. I told her I was here to get married. Maria looked at me with a mixture of profound pity and utter confusion. She said the venue coordinator had told all the vendors to pack up and leave an hour ago. My heart began to pound a heavy, aggressive rhythm against my ribs. I left Gavin with Maria and marched straight toward the main office of the venue. Mr. Harrison, the senior event director, was pacing behind his mahogany desk, wiping sweat from his forehead with a handkerchief. When I pushed the glass door open, he physically jumped. He stammered, asking why I was on the property. I demanded to know why my wedding, which was paid in full, had been dismantled. Mr. Harrison looked terrified. He reached into his leather portfolio and pulled out a single sheet of printed paper, sliding it across the desk toward me. His hands were shaking. He said he received this email at 6 in the morning, marked urgent and legally binding. I picked up the paper. The email was sent from my mother Brenda's primary business account. I read the words out loud while Gavin stepped into the office behind me. The email stated clearly that due to a sudden and severe family emergency, the wedding of Vanessa and Gavin was indefinitely postponed. It instructed the venue to cancel all vendor arrivals immediately to avoid further hourly charges. But the final sentence was the one that made the blood freeze in my veins. Per the bride's mother and primary financial sponsor process all refunds, including the $80,000 deposit to the routing number provided below. I stared at the routing number. It was not my bank account. It was not Gavin's bank account. I recognized those last 4 digits immediately because I had seen them on the letterhead of my brother-in-law DeAndre's corporate law firm. My mother had not just canceled my wedding to humiliate me. She had executed a calculated financial heist to siphon my venue refund into DeAndre's failing business account. Mr. Harrison apologized profusely, saying that since my mother's name was listed as a secondary contact on the initial intake forms, he assumed she had the authority to call it off in an emergency. Before I could even explain the legal ramifications of what my mother had just done, my phone vibrated violently against the desk. It was a text message from my father Richard. The message was cold and dripping with the authoritarian control he had wielded over me my entire life. He demanded I come home immediately, stating no daughter of his marries without his permission, and adding that we needed to have a serious discussion about the assets belonging to my community nonprofit foundation. He actually thought I would fall to my knees in tears and come crawling back to their gated suburban mansion begging for their blessing. He thought the shock of an empty venue would break my spirit. Gavin gently placed his hand on my shoulder. His voice was calm but laced with the sharp analytical edge he used in the courtroom. He asked me if I wanted him to call the local precinct and report a massive wire fraud attempt. I looked at the empty pavilion outside the window. I thought about the months of planning, the stress, the money, and the sheer audacity of my parents treating me like a pawn to fund my golden child sister's lifestyle. I smiled a very cold and steady smile. I told Gavin we were not calling the police just yet. I pulled my phone from my purse and dialed my mother's number, putting it on speakerphone right there in Mr. Harrison's office. The phone rang 3 times before Brenda answered. There was no panic in her voice, no sound of a family emergency. In fact, I could clearly hear the rhythmic hum of her expensive espresso machine in the background and the soft jazz she always played on Sunday mornings. She answered with a casual, drawn-out sigh, asking what I wanted so early in the morning. I did not raise my voice. I kept my tone deadpan and professional. I asked her why I was standing in an empty botanical garden and why she had instructed my vendors to wire my money to DeAndre. Brenda did not even try to deny it. She scoffed as if I was being an unreasonable child complaining about a broken toy. She told me not to be so dramatic. She said I knew perfectly well that DeAndre's law firm was struggling this quarter and that my sister Kelsey was expecting her second baby. She had the absolute nerve to tell me it was incredibly selfish of me to blow $80,000 on a frivolous party when my own flesh and blood sister was facing potential foreclosure on her house. She said she canceled the event so the vendor refunds could go to the people who actually needed it, adding her favorite toxic catchphrase, that family helps family. Gavin crossed his arms, his jaw ticking with silent fury as he listened to her manipulate the narrative. I asked her what gave her the right to steal money that I had saved from running my foundation. Brenda's voice took on that sharp, condescending edge she used whenever she wanted to remind me of my place. She told me I owed them for raising me. She said if I really wanted her and my father to attend a wedding ceremony, I needed to show some actual loyalty. Then she dropped the real ultimatum. She said DeAndre had already drafted a property transfer deed for the downtown building my nonprofit owned. She told me that if I signed the building over to DeAndre's firm today, to save him from bankruptcy, she would call the guests back and tell everyone the cancellation was just a silly clerical mix-up. She promised we could still have a nice little dinner at a local restaurant. But if I refused to sign away the building I had worked for 10 years to secure, she told me to enjoy my empty room and my ruined day. She said nobody would come to a wedding if the bride's own parents refused to bless it. She truly believed she held all the cards. She believed that because I ran a charity, I was weak and naive. She forgot that I spent the last decade fighting city halls, navigating zoning laws, and protecting marginalized communities from predatory people exactly like her. I did not scream. I did not beg. I simply ended the call. Before my mother could speak, I heard an arrogant chuckle. The phone fumbled before a deep voice took over. It was DeAndre, my brother-in-law. DeAndre was a corporate lawyer who never missed an opportunity to remind everyone in the room about his billable hours and his custom-tailored suits. He had always looked down on me for choosing nonprofit work instead of chasing corporate wealth. He cleared his throat using the authoritative tone he used for hostile witnesses in the courtroom. He told me to listen very closely because he was only going to explain the situation once. He said my mother was too emotional to handle the business side of things, so he was stepping in as the legal counsel for our family. I could hear the sheer smugness radiating through the speaker. He actually thought he was intimidating me. He called me sweetheart, which he knew I absolutely despised. He said that unfortunately for me, verbal agreements regarding wedding funding were not legally binding, and since my mother was the primary signer on the vendor accounts, she had every right to liquidate those assets at her discretion. He casually ignored that it was my money she stole. He framed it as a simple reallocation of family funds. He said his firm was going through a temporary cash flow issue, and the $80,000 from my wedding venue was just a drop in the bucket compared to what I actually owed this family for my comfortable upbringing. DeAndre then shifted into full corporate predator mode, pouring on the legal jargon to try and confuse me. He assumed that because I ran a community foundation, I spent my days handing out soup and had no idea how real estate or asset management worked. He started throwing around terms like fiduciary duty asset forfeiture and irrevocable trust transfers. He said he had taken the liberty of drafting a quitclaim deed for the three-story brick building my foundation owned in the downtown arts district. He explained that since my father had originally signed on the initial small business loan 10 years ago, even though I had paid every single cent back, they still had a legitimate claim to the equity. He said all I had to do was digitally sign the transfer document he had just emailed me. By doing so, I would be transferring ownership of the building to his holding company. He called it fair. He said the building would cover his firm current debts and provide a safety net for Kelsey and their new baby. He actually dared to tell me that signing away my life work was the only honorable way to pay my parents back for feeding and clothing me when I was a child. He said it was time for me to stop playing charity worker and start contributing to the family legacy like a real adult. Gavin, who had been standing completely still beside me, suddenly leaned down toward the phone. His voice was dangerously low and steady. Gavin spent his days in overcrowded courtrooms defending people who had nothing, and he had absolutely zero tolerance for wealthy bullies trying to exploit the system. He told DeAndre that what he was doing crossed the line from a civil dispute straight into criminal extortion and wire fraud. He reminded DeAndre that crossing state lines with fraudulent vendor cancellations could trigger a federal investigation. There was a brief pause on the line before DeAndre burst into loud, mocking laughter. He sounded completely unbothered. He told Gavin to stay in his lane. He sneered and called Gavin a glorified social worker in a cheap suit. He said public defenders do not understand complex corporate litigation, and that Gavin should stick to pleading out petty theft cases instead of trying to play with the big boys. DeAndre boasted that his escrow accounts were perfectly insulated and that no local prosecutor would ever waste their time looking into a private family financial disagreement. He told Gavin that if he really loved me, he would advise me to sign the deed immediately before his firm decided to sue my foundation for emotional distress and breach of verbal contract. The sheer arrogance was almost suffocating. He truly believed he was untouchable behind his mahogany desk and his expensive law degree. DeAndre brought the conversation to a screeching halt with his final ultimatum. He dropped the legal jargon and spoke with cold, calculated cruelty. He told me the choice was extremely simple. I could open my email, read the deed transfer, and sign it right now. If I did that, he promised he would have my mother call the venue coordinator back and claim her email was hacked or sent by mistake. He said he would allow the wedding to proceed, and they might even show up for the reception to take family photos if I behaved myself. But if I refused to sign, he promised to make my life a living nightmare. He said he would tie my nonprofit up in so much frivolous litigation that I would spend the next 5 years paying legal fees instead of helping my community. He told me to look around the empty pavilion. He said that emptiness was exactly what my future looked like without the backing of my family. He gave me exactly 1 hour to make my decision before he officially filed the paperwork to place a lien on my property. Then, without waiting, he ended the call. The click of the phone hanging up echoed in the quiet office. Mr. Harrison, the venue director, looked like he was about to pass out from the stress. Gavin looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of rage and fierce protectiveness. But I felt a strange sense of total, absolute clarity. DeAndre thought he had backed me into a corner. He had no idea he had just handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy his entire career. The click of the phone ending the call echoed in the small office. Gavin stood perfectly still, his chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. He looked at me with a fierce intensity that made me realize why I was marrying him. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his cell phone. He told me he was calling the district attorney right now. He said DeAndre had just openly admitted to extortion and that my mother had committed wire fraud. Gavin explained that if we moved fast, we could have police at my parents' house before they finished their coffee. He wanted to see DeAndre in handcuffs. He wanted to watch my mother talk her way out of a felony charge. Mr. Harrison, the venue director, was pale and trembling. He slumped back into his chair, wiping his face with a tissue. He mumbled that he was going to lose his job and that the insurance would never cover a deliberate financial crime orchestrated by a family member. He begged us not to involve the police just yet, saying the negative press would ruin the Botanical Gardens' reputation. I gently placed my hand over Gavin's phone and pressed it down. I looked into his eyes and shook my head. I smiled a cold and calm smile. I told him we were not calling the police. Gavin looked confused. He reminded me that they had just stolen $80,000 and tried to blackmail me out of a building. He said they deserved to be locked up. I agreed with him, but I knew my family better than anyone. If we called the police, my mother would turn on her fake tears. She would tell the officers it was a simple misunderstanding. DeAndre would hire a defense team and drag the case out for years in civil court. They would spin the narrative to make me look like an ungrateful child attacking her generous parents. I refused to let them control the story. I wanted a consequence so undeniably humiliating that they could never show their faces again. I turned my gaze to the large glass window overlooking the grand pavilion. I saw the 300 empty wooden chairs set up on the lawn. I thought about the massive commercial kitchen where 20 chefs were standing around doing nothing. I thought about the thousands of white roses, the imported champagne, the filet mignon and salmon dinners waiting to be cooked. My mother thought she could use this day to break me. She thought leaving me in an empty venue would force me to surrender. She severely underestimated the life I had built outside of her shadow. I opened my contacts list and scrolled past the numbers for lawyers and caterers. I stopped on one specific number. It was the emergency dispatch line for my nonprofit foundation. For the past 10 long years, my organization had served the most vulnerable people in our city. We helped single parents secure housing, provided job training, and funded small local businesses. My family called it a waste of time. I called it my life purpose. I pressed the call button and put the phone to my ear. Jamal, my director of community outreach, picked up on the second ring. He sounded wide awake, wishing me a beautiful wedding day. He said the whole foundation team was thinking of me and Gavin. I took a deep breath and told Jamal there had been a slight change of plans. I explained that my parents had attempted to cancel the wedding behind my back, but the venue was fully paid for until midnight. I told him the food was prepped, the band was paid, and the space was completely empty. Jamal was silent for a moment. He asked me what I wanted to do. I told him I wanted to throw the biggest community appreciation event this city had ever seen. I instructed him to log into our automated mass text message system. We used this system to alert neighborhoods about food drives and free medical clinics. We had over 700 active contacts on that list. I told Jamal to send a blast to every single person in our database. I dictated the message to him right there in the office. I told him to write that the foundation was hosting an immediate pop-up gala at the Botanical Gardens. I told him to make it clear that everyone was invited. The single mothers from the shelter, the teenagers from our after-school mentorship programs, the elderly residents we delivered meals to every week. I wanted them all there. I told Jamal to tell them to come exactly as they were, no fancy suits required. I told him the food was 5-star, the drinks were free, and the gates were open. Jamal let out a joyous laugh. He told me I was completely crazy, but he absolutely loved it. He said he would hit send in exactly 2 minutes, and that he was personally going to drive the community center shuttle bus to bring the families who did not have cars. He promised me the pavilion would be full within the hour. I thanked him and hung up the phone. I turned back to Mr. Harrison, who was staring at me with his mouth slightly open. I politely informed him that the wedding reception was officially back on, but the guest list had been significantly modified. I asked him to radio his catering staff and tell them to start cooking everything they had in the kitchen. Mr. Harrison nervously adjusted his collar. He pointed out that the original contract specified a guest count of exactly 300 people from an approved list. I leaned forward, resting my hands on his mahogany desk. I used my best professional voice. I reminded him that the contract was legally binding and granted me exclusive use of the property until midnight, regardless of who walked through the doors. I pointed out that my foundation had extensive ties to the city council and local media. I assured him that hosting hundreds of community members for a free luxury meal would be the greatest public relations story his venue had ever received. I promised that if he worked with me, I would make sure the Botanical Gardens looked like heroes. Mr. Harrison hesitated for only a second before a slow smile spread across his face. He nodded, picked up his radio, and ordered his staff to fire up the ovens and prepare for a massive crowd. Gavin stood beside me, slipping his phone back into his pocket. He wrapped his strong arm around my waist and kissed my forehead. He told me he had never been more proud of me. We walked out of the office and stepped back onto the white gravel path. The morning sun was finally breaking through the fog, illuminating the empty chairs. I felt a profound sense of true peace. My parents thought they could isolate me by taking away their wealthy friends. They forgot I had spent the last decade building a family of my own. And that beautiful family was just about to arrive today. I stood with Gavin near the grand fountain, watching the catering staff spring into action. Instead of packing up the silver chafing dishes, the executive chef, a tall man named Roberto, actually walked out of the kitchen and came straight over to us. He had heard the frantic radio calls from Mr. Harrison about my parents trying to cancel the wedding and steal the deposit. Roberto looked me right in the eye and wiped his flour-covered hands on his apron. He told me he had a daughter my age, and if anyone ever tried to sabotage her wedding day, he would personally raise hell. He said his entire kitchen crew had just taken a unanimous vote. They were not going anywhere. In fact, they were going to pull out the reserve Wagyu beef, the fresh lobster tails, and the extra truffles they usually saved for the mayor annual gala. Roberto promised me that the people arriving today were going to eat like absolute royalty. I felt a lump form in my throat. My own mother and father had tried to starve me out of my own wedding venue, but these strangers were offering me their absolute best. The waitstaff began moving with incredible speed, unfolding extra tables on the manicured lawn and pulling emergency folding chairs from the storage sheds. The florist, Maria, who had been throwing hydrangeas into her van just 30 minutes ago, was now running back and forth, recreating the massive floral arches with a huge grin on her face. She even started handing out single white roses to the waitstaff to pin to their lapels. Exactly 45 minutes after Jamal sent that mass text message, the main iron gates of the Botanical Gardens swung wide open. I heard the deep rumble of a heavy engine before I saw the bright yellow community center shuttle bus pull up the winding driveway. Jamal was behind the wheel, honking the horn to the beat of a cheerful song playing from the radio. Behind the bus, a massive line of cars, minivans, and city taxicabs stretched all the way down the block, blocking the wealthy suburban traffic. The doors opened and the true heart of my city poured out onto the pristine lawns. I saw Maria, a single mother of 3 whom my foundation had helped secure a safe apartment last winter. She was wearing a beautiful purple dress, and her children were running around the grass laughing at the giant fountain. I saw Jamal leading a large group of teenagers from our downtown mentorship program. These were kids who had been told they would never amount to anything, just like my family had always told me. Today, they were dressed in sharp, borrowed suits and bright dresses, looking so incredibly proud to be there. Then I saw the local bakery owners, the hardware store managers, the retired school janitors, and the community clinic nurses. Some of them carried homemade pies, hand-painted cards, and hastily wrapped gifts. They did not care that they were not on the original country club guest list. They did not care that my wealthy parents deemed them unworthy of an invitation. They heard I was in trouble, and they dropped everything on a Sunday morning to show up for me. Within one single hour, the venue that was supposed to be completely empty was now packed with over 700 people. It was standing room only. The energy in the air was absolutely electric, buzzing with genuine love and fierce loyalty. Through the massive cheering crowd, I spotted Gavin parents pushing their way toward us. Patricia and David were retired public school teachers who had always treated me with more warmth in a single afternoon than my own parents had in 33 years. When they heard what Brenda and Richard had done, Patricia practically sprinted across the lawn, dropping her purse on a chair, and wrapped her arms around me. She pulled me into a fierce, protective hug, holding me so tightly I could feel the genuine anger vibrating in her chest. She smoothed my hair back and looked at me with tears streaming down her face. She told me I looked absolutely breathtaking, and that she was so incredibly sorry my blood relatives were so profoundly broken. David shook Gavin's hand, pulling his son into a tight embrace before turning to me and placing a gentle, comforting hand on my shoulder. He asked me how I was holding up under all this pressure. I told him I was doing fine, but I admitted I was a little nervous about walking down that long, white gravel aisle, completely alone in front of so many people. David smiled a warm, fatherly smile that made my heart ache in the best possible way. He looked at Patricia and then looked back at me. He asked if it would be all right if the two of them walked me down the aisle together. He said they would be honored to stand in the place of the people who did not deserve to give me away. I did not have to think twice. I nodded and hugged them both, thanking them for actually knowing how to be a real loving family. The string quartet, which had happily unpacked their instruments, began to play a beautiful sweeping melody that echoed across the gardens. The loud, cheerful chatter of the 700 people slowly quieted down as they realized the ceremony was about to begin. Jamal and the teenagers from the mentorship program quickly organized themselves into an impromptu bridal party, lining the edges of the aisle to keep the pathway clear. The morning sun was fully shining now, casting a warm golden glow over the massive sea of smiling faces. I took David's arm on my left and Patricia's arm on my right. As we stepped onto the white rose petals leading toward the wooden gazebo, I looked out at the massive crowd. I did not see a single face filled with the toxic judgment or the cold expectation I was so used to seeing at my parents' high society cocktail parties. I saw the faces of people who knew what it meant to struggle to be cast aside and to fight for a better life. I saw a community that had built itself up from nothing standing together to support one of their own. Gavin was waiting for me at the end of the aisle. He looked so incredibly handsome, and his eyes were shining with overwhelming pride and deep love. My mother had tried to ruin this day by stripping away everything she thought gave me value. She thought the expensive catering, the elite guest list, and her conditional approval were the only things that made a wedding special. She was completely wrong. As I walked down that aisle, surrounded by the cheers and the applause of 700 strangers who had become my chosen family, I felt an invincible kind of strength. I knew that no matter what kind of legal threats DeAndre tried to throw at me, or what kind of toxic financial games my parents tried to play, they had already lost. They handed me an empty room expecting me to break and surrender my life work. Instead, I filled it with an army of people who loved me for exactly who I am. And the best part was that my toxic family had absolutely no idea what was waiting for them when they decided to show up later. As Gavin and I shared our first kiss as husband and wife, the crowd of 700 people erupted into a deafening roar of applause. It was a raw, thunderous celebration. People were waving their napkins in the air, whistling and stomping their feet on the manicured grass. I buried my face in Gavin's chest, letting tears of pure joy finally fall. We walked back down the aisle hand in hand, surrounded by the people who had truly shaped my life. As we made our way toward the massive reception tent, where Roberto and his crew were serving plates of Wagyu beef and truffle mashed potatoes, I noticed a familiar face standing near the edge of the rose garden. It was Michelle, a prominent investigative journalist for our city's largest news network. I had mentored Michelle's teenage daughter for 3 years through my foundation, helping her secure a full scholarship when she was struggling with severe anxiety. Michelle had always been fiercely protective of her daughter and deeply grateful for our nonprofit. Today she was not holding a microphone or wearing her studio blazer. She was wearing a simple floral dress, holding her smartphone up and looking around at the massive, vibrant crowd with wide eyes. She saw me looking at her and immediately walked over, wiping a tear from her cheek. She hugged me tightly and whispered that she had never seen anything so incredibly beautiful in her entire life. She told me she had heard whispers from the venue staff about what my parents had tried to do that morning. She knew about the empty chairs, the canceled catering, and the sickening attempt to extort my foundation building to save DeAndre's failing law firm. Michelle looked me dead in the eye and asked me a question that would change the course of the entire day. She asked if I was finally ready to stop protecting the people who had spent my entire life trying to break me. For 33 years, I had been the perfect silent daughter. I kept my family's dark secrets hidden behind the walls of their suburban mansion. I never told anyone how my mother Brenda used my college savings to buy Kelsey a luxury car, or how my father Richard constantly belittled my charity work to his wealthy investor friends. I had always swallowed my pride to maintain the illusion of their perfect high society family. But standing there in my wedding dress, looking at the hundreds of marginalized community members who had dropped everything to support me, I realized that protecting my abusers was only enabling them. Gavin squeezed my hand, letting me know that whatever I decided, he was entirely on my side. I looked back at Michelle and gave her a firm nod. I told her I was done hiding the truth. I told her to turn on her camera and show the world exactly what a real family looks like. Michelle smiled a sharp, journalistic smile that meant business. She stepped back, adjusted the angle of her smartphone, and logged directly into her professional social media accounts, which boasted hundreds of thousands of local followers. She did not need a camera crew or a studio lighting setup. The bright afternoon sun and the joyous, chaotic background of 700 people eating and laughing provided the perfect setting. She hit the live broadcast button and took a deep breath, stepping seamlessly into her reporter persona. I watched as Michelle looked directly into the lens and began to speak with a clear, commanding voice. She welcomed her viewers and apologized for the impromptu weekend broadcast. Then she delivered a hook that immediately grabbed the attention of anyone scrolling through their feed. She said a toxic, wealthy family tried to leave a bride completely alone at the altar this morning. She pointed her camera toward the beautiful floral arches and the massive crowd enjoying the feast. She explained that a mother and father deliberately canceled their own daughter's wedding behind her back, attempting to siphon the $80,000 venue refund into a failing corporate law firm owned by the golden child brother-in-law. She did not say their names out loud, but she described the situation with such precise detail that anyone in our local high society circles would know exactly who she was talking about. Michelle described how the parents demanded the bride sign over the deed to a community nonprofit building in exchange for their attendance. She told her audience how the bride, instead of crying or surrendering, simply opened the gates to the very community she had spent 10 years serving. Michelle panned the camera around the Botanical Gardens, capturing the single mothers, the at-risk youth, and the local small business owners who were all raising their glasses in celebration. She concluded her opening monologue by stating that this was a masterclass in female empowerment and a beautiful reminder that blood does not make a family. The reaction was absolutely instantaneous. Because Michelle was a highly respected local figure, her live stream immediately caught the algorithm's attention. Within 3 minutes, she had 5,000 viewers. Within 10 minutes, that number skyrocketed to over 30,000 people watching live from across the state. I could see the notifications exploding on her phone screen like fireworks. People in the crowd began pulling out their own phones, realizing they were part of a massive viral moment. Teenagers from my mentorship program started sharing the stream to their own networks, adding their own stories about how my foundation had changed their lives. The comment section was a blur of righteous anger and overwhelming support. Viewers were demanding to know the name of the greedy law firm. They were calling the parents monsters and praising Gavin and me for standing our ground. Local business owners started commenting, offering to send more food-free honeymoon packages and donations to my nonprofit. The narrative had completely shifted out of my parents' control. They had always relied on their pristine country club reputation to manipulate people and conduct their shady financial dealings. Now that pristine image was being broadcasted and dissected by tens of thousands of angry locals. I felt an incredible weight lift off my shoulders. The suffocating blanket of shame I had carried since childhood was entirely gone. I was no longer the scapegoat daughter hiding in the shadows. I was a strong, independent woman, surrounded by an army of fierce protectors, and the absolute truth was finally out in the open. While we danced under the warm sun, justice was making its way to the wealthy suburbs. Across town, my mother Brenda was likely sipping a mimosa, entirely confident I would sign away my building by noon. But they forgot one crucial detail about the elite circles they worshipped. Gossip travels incredibly fast. A prominent country club member who followed the news page saw the viral broadcast and recognized the venue. Realizing exactly whose wedding had just been exposed, this eager friend forwarded the live stream link directly to my mother's phone. The timer on their smug ignorance had officially run out. The perfect stage was set for their chaotic arrival. While Gavin and I were dancing under the afternoon sun, surrounded by our chosen family, my actual blood relatives were sitting comfortably in the sunroom of my parents' sprawling suburban estate. I can imagine the suffocating arrogance filling that room. My mother Brenda was likely wearing her silk lounging robe, sipping a mimosa, while casually scrolling through her tablet. She thought she had executed the perfect plan. My father Richard was likely sitting in his leather armchair reading the Financial Times, completely convinced he had taught his disobedient daughter a permanent lesson in loyalty. Across the room, my sister Kelsey, the perpetually pregnant golden child, was complaining about her swollen ankles while her husband DeAndre paced the floor, checking his designer watch. They were simply waiting for my phone call. They were waiting for me to break down in tears, beg for forgiveness, and tell them I had signed away my foundation building just to save DeAndre failing law firm. They were so incredibly certain of their ultimate power over me. They truly believed I was sitting alone in an empty venue crying over a ruined dress. They thought my self-worth was tied to their conditional approval and their wealthy social circles. They had absolutely no idea that a massive storm of public humiliation was heading straight for their pristine front door. I picture DeAndre adjusting his expensive silk tie, telling my father how easily he outsmarted Gavin on the phone. DeAndre always loved to brag about his legal prowess, especially when bullying someone significantly beneath his tax bracket. He assured my parents that my nonprofit building would be legally transferred into his holding company by noon and that Kelsey would never have to worry about their mortgage payments again. My parents praised him for being a strong, reliable provider, completely ignoring the horrifying fact that they were actively attempting to steal their other daughter life work to fund his extravagant lifestyle. They were celebrating a massive victory they had not actually won. But the universe has a very precise way of delivering karma. Right around the time the catering staff was bringing out the third course of Wagyu beef and truffle potatoes, my mother's cell phone chimed loudly on the glass coffee table. It was not a text message from me begging for mercy. It was an urgent, frantic message from Beatrice, one of my mother's wealthiest and most gossip-hungry friends from the private country club. Beatrice simply sent a direct link to Michelle's live broadcast with a short message asking if my mother had lost her absolute mind. Brenda, annoyed by the sudden interruption, set down her crystal glass and tapped the link. The high-definition video loaded instantly. Because she had her phone volume turned all the way up, the joyful sounds of my wedding reception echoed loudly through their quiet sunroom. The loud cheering, the live string quartet playing upbeat music, and the clinking of champagne glasses filled the air. Then Michelle's sharp professional voice cut right through the noise. Brenda stared at the digital screen in pure shock as the camera panned over the massive crowd of 700 people eating, laughing, and celebrating. But the visual was not the worst part for them. The worst part was the audio. Michelle was holding absolutely nothing back. My mother listened in absolute horror as the highly respected local journalist exposed every single devastating detail of their toxic mourning scheme. She heard Michelle tell tens of thousands of live viewers exactly how a greedy mother canceled her own daughter's wedding to steal an $80,000 venue refund. She heard Michelle explain exactly how the family tried to extort a community charity building just to save a failing corporate law firm. The color completely drained from my mother's face. DeAndre, hearing the words failing corporate law firm, rushed over and grabbed the phone out of her hands. His confident demeanor shattered into pieces. He stared at the screen, watching the live viewer count climb past 40,000 people. He knew exactly what this meant. He knew that local judges, senior partners, and potential clients were watching this broadcast right now. Michelle did not even have to say his name. Anyone in their elite circle who knew Kelsey was pregnant and married to a corporate attorney could easily connect the dots. DeAndre's career reputation was burning to the ground in real time. My father, Richard, jumped out of his armchair, his face turning a dangerous shade of red. He could not comprehend how I managed to fill the venue. He could not understand why I was not begging for his help. Instead of feeling remorse, their only emotion was sheer panic over their public image. Kelsey started crying real tears, realizing her perfect country club life was suddenly a massive local scandal. Richard began shouting orders, telling everyone to get to the car immediately. They only cared about stopping the broadcast and silencing me before I could do any more damage to their social standing. DeAndre practically ran to my father's luxury vehicle, his designer shoes slipping on the driveway. Brenda grabbed her purse, forgetting to change out of her silk lounging robe, and threw herself into the passenger seat. Richard slammed his foot on the gas pedal, speeding out of their gated community and breaking every traffic law as they raced toward the Botanical Gardens. The car ride must have been filled with toxic blame and frantic screaming. DeAndre blaming my mother for getting caught, and my father furious about losing control of his family. It took them less than 20 minutes to cross the city. Back at the reception, the sun was shining, the drinks were flowing, and Gavin was spinning me around the dance floor. Jamal was leading a massive group dance with the teenagers, and the catering staff walked around with heavy trays of decadent desserts. It was the most joyful atmosphere I had ever experienced. I felt incredibly light and free. But my newfound peace was abruptly interrupted. The heavy oak and iron doors separating the private garden from the main lobby did not just open. They burst open with a violent echoing crash. The heavy wood slammed against the stone walls, causing a loud crack that rippled across the lawn. The string quartet stopped playing mid-note. The laughter died down instantly. 700 people slowly turned their heads toward the grand entrance. The silence falling over the massive pavilion was thick and heavy. Standing right there in the archway, breathing heavily and looking completely deranged, was my toxic family. Richard was clenching his fists, his face dark with rage. DeAndre was sweating profusely, his tie loosened, and his eyes darting frantically around the crowd, looking for the journalist camera. Kelsey was hiding behind her husband, holding her pregnant belly, terrified of the crowd. Standing right in the front was my mother, Brenda. She looked absolutely unhinged, staring at me with pure, unfiltered hatred. They thought they could storm in and take back control of the narrative. They thought they could yell at me and shut down the party. But as they looked out at the massive sea of 700 fiercely loyal people standing securely between them and me, they finally realized the terrifying truth. I was no longer their silent victim. The heavy oak doors slammed against the stone walls, and the entire pavilion fell completely silent. The string quartet stopped playing instantly. 700 people turned to stare at the grand entrance. Standing right in the center of the archway was my mother, Brenda. I had expected her to be angry or panicked, but I was absolutely not prepared for what she was wearing. My mother had actually shown up to my wedding reception wearing a floor-length ivory white lace gown. It was not a simple cocktail dress. It was a literal wedding dress, complete with pearl embellishments and a sweeping train. The sheer audacity of a mother wearing a white gown to her own daughter's wedding was enough to make anyone gasp, but to do it after trying to cancel the entire event was a level of narcissistic delusion I could barely comprehend. She stood there breathing heavily, her eyes scanning the massive crowd until they finally locked onto me. I was standing near the center of the dance floor with Gavin, his hand resting protectively on the small of my back. For a split second, I saw raw panic in my mother's eyes. She realized that her elite country club friends were watching this unfold on the internet. She knew she was caught. But my mother had spent her entire adult life spinning lies to protect her social image, and she was not about to stop now. Instead of apologizing or retreating, she violently shoved her way past the bewildered venue's security guards. She plastered a massive trembling smile onto her face and began to march directly toward the DJ booth at the edge of the lawn. She walked with a manic, terrifying energy, pretending to wave at the crowd as if they were her honored guests. DeAndre and Richard followed closely behind her, looking like terrified bodyguards, while Kelsey trailed in the back, trying to hide her face from the hundreds of cell phones that were suddenly pointed in their direction. The crowd parted for my mother, not out of respect, but out of pure shock and disgust. People pulled their children closer and stepped back as she marched through the tables. When she reached the DJ booth, she aggressively reached over the equipment and snatched the wireless microphone right out of the young man's hand. The DJ tried to protest, but Richard stepped forward, glaring at him until the young man backed away. A loud, sharp screech of audio feedback echoed across the Botanical Gardens, making everyone wince. My mother stood at the front of the dance floor, tapping the microphone to make sure it was on. Then, right on cue, she forced her eyes to well up with fake tears. She let out a dramatic breath and pressed her hand against her chest, looking out at the sea of 700 strangers. She spoke into the microphone, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. She welcomed everyone to the Botanical Gardens and said she was so incredibly thrilled that her little surprise had worked out perfectly. She actually tried to claim that the morning cancellation was just a clever distraction. She told the crowd that she and my father had secretly planned this massive community event for months because they knew how much I loved my charity work. She wiped a single fake tear from her cheek and declared that as the mother of the bride and the primary financial sponsor of this gorgeous venue, she was honored to share this luxury feast with the less fortunate. She called herself a proud philanthropist. She looked directly at Michelle's smartphone camera, which was still broadcasting live, and smiled her most practiced country club smile. She truly thought she could gaslight 700 people into believing she was a generous hero instead of a manipulative thief. The silence that followed her speech was deafening. Nobody clapped. Nobody cheered. The single mothers, the local business owners, and the teenagers from my mentorship program just stared at her with absolute contempt. They had all watched Michelle live broadcast. They all knew exactly why the venue was empty this morning, and they knew exactly who tried to steal my money. A few people in the back started booing, but I raised my hand to quiet them. I did not need the crowd to fight this battle for me. I gently squeezed Gavin's hand, let go, and walked slowly across the dance floor toward my mother. Every step I took felt incredibly grounding. I was no longer the frightened little girl who used to hide in her bedroom when her mother threw a tantrum. I was a 33-year-old woman standing in her own power. When I reached my mother, she tried to pull me into a forced hug for the cameras. I firmly stepped back, refusing to let her touch me. I reached out and took the microphone from her hand. She resisted for a second, her knuckles turning white, but I gave her a look so cold and unyielding that she finally let go. I turned to face the crowd and then looked directly at my mother. I spoke clearly and evenly, making sure my voice carried across the entire pavilion and straight into the live broadcast. I thanked her for her beautiful words, but told her we both knew there was no surprise community event planned. I told her the only surprise was that she actually had the nerve to show up wearing a white wedding dress after trying to extort my foundation out of a building. My mother, fake smile, violently twitched. She leaned in and whispered frantically through gritted teeth, telling me to shut my mouth and play along before I ruined the family name permanently. I ignored her completely. I brought the microphone closer to my face and decided it was time to burn the final bridge. I addressed the crowd, but my eyes never left my mother's face. I told everyone that my mother claimed to be the primary financial sponsor of this wedding. I laughed a very dry, humorless laugh. I revealed that I had paid for every single flower, every plate of food, and every chair on this lawn using my own savings. I told the crowd that my parents had never funded a single thing in my adult life. Then I dropped the absolute truth bomb. I told my mother she had no right to talk about funding anything considering how she paid for my sister's education. I pointed directly at Kelsey, who gasped and took a step back. I announced to the entire garden and the 40,000 people watching online that when I was 18 years old, my mother secretly drained the college fund my grandfather had left specifically for me. I told them she took my money and used it to pay for Kelsey out-of-state tuition and a luxury sports car just because Kelsey was her favorite. I told her she had spent my entire life stealing from me to fund her golden child, and that today was the exact moment that generational theft officially ended. The collective gasp from the crowd was loud enough to shake the tent. The local business owners who knew the value of hard-earned money began shouting in anger. The teenagers from my program glared at Kelsey and DeAndre with fierce, protective rage. My mother took a staggering step backward, her face turning ashen pale. The perfect, pristine illusion of her high society life had just been completely shattered in front of the entire city. She opened her mouth to speak, to scream, to deny it, but no words came out. She was suffocating on her own exposed lies. She looked at Richard for help, but my father was completely paralyzed, staring at the hundreds of camera phones, recording their ultimate humiliation. I stood tall, holding the microphone tightly, feeling the absolute freedom of the truth. I had just dismantled her entire reality with a single story, and there was absolutely nothing she could do to stop the avalanche that was about to crush them. My mother stood frozen on the dance floor, her jaw trembling as the reality of her exposure washed over her. Right on cue, my father Richard stepped forward. My father commanded corporate boardrooms and country clubs with an iron fist. He shoved past the stunned waiters, his face flushed a dangerous shade of red. The veins in his neck pulsed with rage. He did not care that 700 community members were watching, or that Michelle was broadcasting this meltdown live to tens of thousands of viewers. In his authoritarian mind, he was still the ruler of our family, and I was just a disobedient child who needed to be brought in line. He marched right up to me, invading my personal space to physically intimidate me, just like he did when I was a teenager. Gavin immediately stepped between us, but I gently placed my hand on his arm. I did not need to hide behind my husband. I stood my ground, looking directly into my father's furious eyes. For the first time in 33 years, I felt no anxiety. I only felt pity. He pointed a trembling finger at my face and ordered me to drop the microphone. He said I was making a fool of myself and damaging the family legacy he spent decades building. Richard did not lower his voice, wanting the crowd to hear that he was still in control. He shouted that I was an ungrateful, spoiled brat who had no respect for the people who put a roof over my head. He completely ignored the fact that my mother had just been exposed for stealing my college fund. Instead, he doubled down on the gaslighting. He told the crowd I was prone to dramatic outbursts, and they should not believe a word I said. He yelled that running a silly little charity had completely detached me from the real world. He loudly reminded me he had paid for my childhood braces, my private school uniforms, and my first bicycle. He listed off basic parental obligations as if they were massive financial debts I was legally required to repay. He looked around at the silent, angry faces of the single mothers and the local business owners and sneered. He told me I was embarrassing myself by throwing a trashy party with people who did not even belong in a place like the Botanical Gardens. He said I was dragging the family name through the mud just to stroke my own ego. The sheer elitism and cruelty pouring out of his mouth only proved everything I had ever said about him. The crowd began to murmur in disgust, but Richard was too blinded by his own arrogance to read the room. He turned his attention back to me, and his voice grew even colder and more demanding. He told me the ridiculous little stunt was over. He demanded that I apologize to my mother immediately for disrespecting her in public. He said if I said I was sorry, he might be willing to forgive this massive embarrassment and handle things quietly behind closed doors like a respectable family. When I simply smiled at his absurd demand, his anger boiled over into outright financial extortion. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a folded stack of legal papers. He slammed the papers onto the nearest dining table, knocking over a crystal champagne flute. He pointed at the documents and told me those were the property transfer deeds DeAndre had prepared for my nonprofit building. He said he was done asking nicely. He demanded I sign the building over to DeAndre Holding Company right this exact second to compensate the family for the emotional distress I had caused them today. He actually believed that publicly yelling at me would break my resolve. He tried to frame it as a fair trade. He said the building was the only way to save Kelsey and DeAndre from bankruptcy, and since I was the one who selfishly blew $80,000 on a wedding, I owed them my most valuable asset. I looked down at the papers and then back up at my father. I asked him what would happen if I refused to sign away the foundation I had spent 10 years building from the ground up. Richard let out a harsh, mocking laugh. He stood up straight, trying to look as tall and imposing as possible. He delivered his ultimate threat, the one weapon wealthy, toxic parents always use when they lose emotional control over their children. He looked me dead in the eye and told me that if I did not sign that paper right now, he would contact his estate lawyer first thing Monday morning. He threatened to cut me completely out of his will. He promised to leave every single penny of his estate, his investment portfolios, and his properties entirely to Kelsey and DeAndre. He said I would be left with absolutely nothing, and that I would die penniless, just like the charity cases I spent my life defending. He waited for me to gasp or start crying. He waited for the fear of losing my inheritance to force me into submission. He truly believed that money was the only thing that mattered in this world, because it was the only thing that mattered to him. I looked at the red-faced, angry man standing in front of me, and I realized he had absolutely no power over me anymore. I picked up the heavy wireless microphone and brought it back to my lips. I made sure every single person in the venue and the 40,000 people watching online heard my response. I kept my voice incredibly calm and completely steady. I told my father to go ahead and call his lawyer. I told him to cut me out of the will today. I explained that I did not want a single cent of his money, because his money was poisoned with strings conditions and emotional abuse. I told him I had built my own wealth, my own successful foundation, and my own beautiful family without him. I looked at the crowd and told them that true wealth is not measured by the numbers in a trust fund, but by the loyalty and love of the people who show up for you when things get hard. I told my father he could keep his millions because I was already richer than he would ever be. His normally angry face went completely slack. The ultimate financial threat had completely failed. He had fired his biggest weapon, and it did not even leave a scratch. He opened his mouth in pure shock, but he had absolutely nothing left to say. He realized in front of the entire city that he could not buy my obedience anymore. The crowd erupted into massive cheers and applause, validating my absolute independence. But my father's failure to control me was only the beginning of their nightmare. Because right behind him, my brother-in-law DeAndre was stepping forward, ready to make the biggest legal mistake of his entire professional career. My father, Richard, stood completely frozen on the dance floor, his ultimate financial threat hanging uselessly in the air. He had played his final card and lost. The crowd was cheering for my independence, and the sheer volume of their support seemed to physically push my parents backward. But the conflict was far from over, because the person who had the most to lose today was not my father. It was my brother-in-law, DeAndre. DeAndre had built his entire identity around being the wealthy, successful corporate lawyer who could fix any problem for the family. He had promised my parents he would secure my foundation building to save his own failing law firm. Now he was watching tens of thousands of people online witness his absolute failure. The veins in his forehead were visibly bulging as he looked at the cell phones recording him. He realized that if he did not walk out of this botanical garden with a signed property deed, his firm would be bankrupt by the end of the month, and his fake luxury lifestyle would be completely over forever. Driven by sheer financial desperation, DeAndre pushed his way past my father. He unbuttoned his expensive custom-tailored suit jacket, trying to puff out his chest and look physically intimidating. DeAndre was a tall, heavily built man who was used to using his physical size to bully people in negotiation rooms. He marched aggressively across the white rose petals, completely ignoring me, and walked straight toward my husband Gavin. He stopped less than a foot away from Gavin, trying to force him to step backward, but Gavin did not move a single inch. He stood his ground, his posture relaxed but entirely alert. DeAndre sneered, his face twisted in a mask of pure arrogant desperation. He pointed a thick finger hard into Gavin's chest. He raised his voice, making sure the crowd in the live stream picked up every single toxic word. He told Gavin that this was grown man business, and he needed to step aside. DeAndre laughed a harsh mocking sound and loudly called Gavin a measly public defender who was way out of his depth. He told the entire crowd that Gavin spent his days babysitting petty criminals for a pathetic state salary, while real lawyers like him handled millions of dollars in corporate assets. He actually tried to emasculate my husband right there on our wedding day. DeAndre asked Gavin how it felt to know he could never give me the luxury lifestyle my parents had always provided. He bragged loudly about his own expensive imported sports cars, his exclusive country club memberships, and the designer maternity clothes his pregnant wife Kelsey was wearing. He said that a cheap government employee had absolutely no right to interfere in high-level private family estate matters. He told Gavin to be a good little social worker and let the real men handle the financial paperwork before he got legally and professionally crushed. The sheer arrogance pouring out of his mouth was suffocating. DeAndre truly believed that having a larger paycheck and a fancier job title made him a fundamentally superior human being. He thought mocking Gavin's dedicated public service career would humiliate him in front of our community. He foolishly assumed the local business owners and hardworking charity workers in the crowd would suddenly respect him because he wore a Rolex watch and carried a designer briefcase. DeAndre was incredibly wrong. The massive crowd of 700 people actually began to boo him loudly. The people at this reception were the exact everyday citizens Gavin spent his entire career defending. They knew the value of a public defender. Gavin simply looked down at the heavy finger aggressively poking his chest, and then looked back up at DeAndre. He did not yell. He did not lose his temper. Gavin possessed the quiet, dangerous confidence of a man who fought absolute monsters in the courtroom every single day. He gently but firmly swatted DeAndre's hand away. He spoke with a terrifyingly calm voice, telling DeAndre that touching him again would be a massive mistake. Gavin said he might just be a public defender, but he actually won his cases without having to steal money from his mother-in-law. DeAndre's face turned bright red with embarrassment as the crowd erupted in loud, mocking laughter. His physical intimidation tactic had failed miserably, so he immediately pivoted his rage back toward me. He snatched the property transfer deeds off the table where my father had slammed them down and shoved them directly into my face. DeAndre dropped the personal insults and went straight for the corporate throat. He told me I had exactly 2 minutes to sign the document transferring my foundation building to his holding company. He said if I did not sign it, he was going to destroy everything I had built over the last 10 years. He outlined his plan with cold, vicious detail. DeAndre loudly promised to file a massive, aggressive civil lawsuit against my nonprofit first thing Monday morning. He said he would claim my father was a silent partner in the charity and demand a full freeze on all of our operating assets. He threatened to tie my foundation up in endless corporate litigation for the next 5 years. He told me that even if his claims were entirely baseless, the legal fees alone would bankrupt my community center within 6 months. He painted a horrifying picture of my future. He said I would have to fire all of my hard-working staff, shut down the after-school youth programs, and evict the single mothers from our transitional housing. He said he would personally make sure I watched my life work slowly bleed to death in the court system. He yelled that he had a team of 10 ruthless corporate associates ready to draft subpoenas and bury me in so much paperwork I would never sleep again. He told me to look at the teenagers and the families sitting in the crowd. He said their future was entirely in my hands right now. He ruthlessly demanded I sacrifice my building to save his law firm, or he would happily watch my charity burn straight to the very ground. He shoved a gold-plated pen toward my hand, telling me to stop being a stubborn little girl and sign the paper immediately. DeAndre was breathing heavily, a smug, triumphant smile returning to his sweaty face. He actually thought he had checkmated me. He thought threatening the vulnerable people I cared about would force me into total submission. He believed his fancy corporate law degree made him the smartest and most dangerous person in the Botanical Gardens today. But as I looked at him holding that gold pen, I did not feel an ounce of fear. I only felt an overwhelming sense of absolute victory. Because DeAndre had just openly threatened to file fraudulent corporate lawsuits to extort a registered nonprofit charity across state lines on a live internet broadcast. He had completely miscalculated his audience, and he had no idea he had just walked directly into a massive, inescapable legal trap. DeAndre stood there breathing heavily with that heavy, gold-plated pen extended toward my face. He believed he had won. He thought that by threatening the vulnerable teenagers and the hardworking single mothers who relied on my foundation, he had found the ultimate leverage to break my spirit. He looked around the silent pavilion, expecting the massive crowd to cower under his immense corporate power. He fully expected the local small business owners and the dedicated charity workers to fall to their knees and beg me to sign the property papers just to save their beloved community center. But nobody begged. The incredible people standing together in that garden were not easily intimidated by arrogant men in expensive tailored suits. They had faced real agonizing hardships in their daily lives, and they instantly recognized a toxic bully when they saw one. I looked at the shiny gold pen trembling slightly in his sweaty hand, and then I looked slowly up into his desperate, frantic eyes. I did not reach for the pen. I did not cry, and I did not panic. I simply stood there next to my husband Gavin, feeling completely anchored to the solid ground beneath my feet. For 10 long years, my parents and my sister had treated my nonprofit work like a cute little hobby. They constantly called it a massive waste of time and a terrible financial investment. Because they only cared about elite country club status and massive corporate profit margins, they never once bothered to ask how my foundation actually operated. They never bothered to look into who generously funded our local initiatives or who sat on our prestigious board of directors. That arrogant, willful ignorance was about to become the single most devastating mistake of DeAndre's entire professional life. I took a deep breath and let the heavy silence stretch for a few agonizing seconds. The tension in the warm afternoon air was so incredibly thick, you could practically feel it vibrating against your skin. I looked directly into the camera lens of Michelle's smartphone, making absolutely sure the 40,000 people watching the live broadcast were paying very close attention to my next words. I kept my voice perfectly level and spoke with absolute crystal clarity. I told DeAndre that he had just stood in front of 700 eyewitnesses and tens of thousands of online viewers and openly threatened to file malicious and completely fraudulent civil lawsuits against a registered state charity. I calmly broke down exactly what he had just done, so there would be absolutely no confusion for the public record. I explained to the crowd that he had maliciously threatened to freeze the vital operating assets of a community foundation solely to extort a piece of valuable commercial real estate. I pointed out that he explicitly stated his intention to use the local court system to bankrupt a charity just to cover his own private law firm debts. Gavin stood beside me, his posture radiating quiet strength, and he nodded in agreement as I laid out the legal reality. DeAndre scoffed loudly and rolled his eyes, totally missing the massive danger he was standing in. He told me to stop playing amateur lawyer and just sign the paper before he made things worse for me and my husband. He actually laughed an ugly, bitter sound and said that nobody in this pathetic crowd could ever afford to stop him. He was so completely blinded by his own massive corporate ego that he genuinely believed he was the most powerful person in the Botanical Gardens. I smiled a very small, very cold smile. I told DeAndre he was absolutely right about one specific thing. I told him I was certainly not a lawyer. But I also told him that running a highly successful multi-million-dollar state-funded community foundation required me to have some extremely powerful legal advisors standing firmly on my side. I turned my attention away from his sweaty, arrogant face and looked toward the front row of folding chairs near the edge of the wooden dance floor. I made direct, purposeful eye contact with a tall, incredibly elegant African American woman who had been sitting quietly observing through the entire chaotic ordeal. Her name was Josephine Carter. Josephine was a woman who commanded absolute immediate respect the second she walked into any room. She was wearing a simple, perfectly tailored navy blue suit, and her expression was completely unreadable and fiercely calm. Josephine was not just a casual supporter of my community charity. She was the brilliant founding chairperson of my board of directors, and she had mentored me through countless legal battles over the past decade. But far more importantly, outside of her dedicated volunteer work with my foundation, she held a very prominent, very powerful elected position in our state government. I gave Josephine a small, respectful nod. She slowly stood up from her wooden chair, and the people around her immediately stepped back to give her plenty of space. The authoritative, graceful way she moved instantly caught DeAndre's attention. He looked at her, his arrogant smirk faltering for just a fraction of a second, as his brain tried to figure out who she was and exactly why she was approaching him with such terrifying, unwavering confidence. Josephine walked calmly across the white rose petals, her low heels clicking softly against the stone pathway. She stopped right next to me, and Gavin standing directly face to face with DeAndre. She did not raise her voice, but the sheer undeniable authority in her tone made DeAndre instinctively take a half step backward. Josephine introduced herself clearly and formally. She stated her full name and then she calmly announced her official government title. She was the State Attorney General. The collective gasp from my toxic family was loud enough to be clearly captured by the live stream microphones. My father Richard physically stumbled backward, his face instantly draining of all color. My mother Brenda covered her mouth with trembling hands, her eyes wide with absolute terror. DeAndre dropped the expensive gold pen onto the grass. His impressive corporate vocabulary completely evaporated into thin air. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out except a pathetic, barely audible stuttering sound. Josephine looked him up and down with absolute professional disgust. She told him that as a practicing corporate attorney, he really should have brushed up on his criminal law before attempting to blackmail a state-funded charity on a live public broadcast. She delivered the final devastating blow with absolute surgical precision. She calmly informed DeAndre that using electronic communications and fraudulent vendor cancellations to extort commercial property across state lines was not a simple private family dispute. She told him it was a severe federal offense that carried a mandatory minimum sentence of 5 years in a federal prison. She promised him, looking him dead in the eye, that her office would be launching a full criminal investigation into his law firm escrow accounts the very next morning. DeAndre realized in that exact horrifying moment that his career, his freedom, and his entire luxurious life were completely over. The trap had fully snapped shut, and there was absolutely no way out. DeAndre stood paralyzed on the grass. The sheer magnitude of the Attorney General standing before him had completely shattered his corporate armor. He looked at Josephine and then darted his eyes toward the exit as if he was calculating how fast he could run away. But my mother Brenda was not ready to surrender. She had spent her entire life manipulating reality to fit her narrative, and she desperately tried to do it again. She pushed her way past my silent father and grabbed my arm. Her fingers dug into my skin as she forced a hysterical laugh. She looked at Josephine and then at the crowd, claiming this was all a ridiculous misunderstanding. She said I was just a stressed bride blowing a tiny logistical error completely out of proportion. She tried to use her sweet motherly voice, telling everyone that she was simply trying to manage the wedding finances to help me out. She actually looked right into Michelle's smartphone camera and said she would never do anything to hurt her own daughter. I calmly reached down and peeled her fingers off my arm one by one. I stepped back and looked at her with absolute disgust. I told her the time for playing the loving mother was officially over. I turned to Gavin and gave him a small nod. Gavin reached into his leather messenger bag, which he had kept slung over his shoulder this entire time. He pulled out a thick, heavy manila folder and handed it to me. The folder was packed tightly with printed emails, bank statements, and legal contracts. I held it up for the entire crowd to see. I told my mother that the problem with treating me like an idiot was that she forgot I ran a highly audited, state-funded organization. I spent my days tracking every single penny of charity money, keeping meticulous records, and dealing with complex grant compliance. I knew exactly how to follow a paper trail. I opened the folder and pulled out the top stack of papers. The crisp sound of the pages turning echoed across the silent pavilion. I held up the first document so Michelle's camera could capture it clearly. I told the crowd this was the original contract I had signed with the Botanical Gardens exactly 10 months ago. I pointed out my signature at the bottom and the specific routing number for my own personal savings account where any potential refunds were legally required to be sent. Then I pulled out the second document. I told everyone this was the emergency cancellation form submitted to the venue at 6 o'clock this morning. I looked directly at my mother and asked her to explain why my signature on this new form was clearly forged. Brenda's face turned a sickly shade of gray. She opened her mouth, but she had absolutely no explanation. I did not let her interrupt me. I kept going, my voice echoing powerfully through the microphone. I told the audience that my mother had not just sent a quick email, she had downloaded the official venue cancellation forms, digitally forged my signature, and manually typed in a brand new set of banking routing numbers. I held up the printed email Mr. Harrison had given me earlier that morning. I read my mother's exact words out loud for the 40,000 people watching online. I read the sentence instructing the venue to process the $80,000 deposit refund to the newly provided account. The crowd gasped loudly at the sheer amount of money. $80,000 was a life-changing amount of money for most of the people standing in that garden. To hear that a mother would steal that exact amount from her own child on her wedding day was completely incomprehensible to them. I turned my gaze away from my mother and locked eyes with DeAndre. He was sweating profusely, wiping his forehead with a silk handkerchief. I held up the final piece of paper from the folder. It was a printed directory listing of local corporate law firms and their registered public financial details. I read the routing number from my mother-forged cancellation form out loud. Then I read the routing number associated with DeAndre's primary corporate escrow account. They were an exact perfect match. I told the entire crowd that my mother did not just steal $80,000 from me. She specifically conspired to wire stolen funds across state lines directly into a corporate law firm account to cover up the fact that DeAndre's business was failing. I explained that my parents were so incredibly obsessed with maintaining the fake wealthy image of their golden child and her successful husband that they were willing to commit federal wire fraud to keep the illusion alive. I told DeAndre that he was not a successful lawyer. He was a fraud who had to rely on his mother-in-law stealing from her own daughter just to keep the lights on in his fancy corner office. The absolute silence in the garden was instantly replaced by an uproar of anger from the crowd. The local business owners who worked hard for every single dollar they earned started shouting at my parents. The teenagers from my mentorship program booed loudly, pointing at DeAndre. Michelle, the journalist, was providing live commentary into her phone, breaking down the massive legal implications of the forged documents I had just presented. My mother, Brenda, physically collapsed into a nearby wooden chair, burying her face in her hands. The pristine white wedding dress she had worn to upstage me now looked like a ridiculous, pathetic costume. My father, Richard, stood completely frozen, staring at the manila folder in my hands as if it were a loaded weapon. He realized that I had hard, undeniable documentary evidence of their crimes. I did not just have an emotional argument, I had the exact paper trail the Attorney General would need to put them in prison. I closed the folder and handed it back to Gavin. I felt a massive, overwhelming wave of closure wash over me. I had finally dragged their darkest, ugliest secrets out into the bright afternoon sun, and the truth was completely setting me free. My mother, Brenda, dropped her hands from her face and shot up from the wooden chair. She realized crying was not going to save her from the Attorney General, so she switched back to aggressive gaslighting. She pointed a shaking finger at me and screamed I was being completely ridiculous. She yelled that as my mother, she had every legal and moral right to manage my finances. She tried to convince the silent crowd that I was just a naive charity worker who had no idea how to handle large sums of money. She claimed she was stepping in as a protective financial guardian to prevent me from wasting $80,000 on a single party. She said she was simply moving the funds to a secure family account to keep the money safe. She tried to frame her attempted theft as an act of profound maternal love. She told everyone family wealth belongs to the family, and I was being selfish for hoarding my savings when DeAndre and Kelsey were struggling. She looked around the pavilion, desperately waiting for someone to nod in agreement. But the local business owners and the single mothers just glared at her with absolute disgust. They knew exactly what financial abuse looked like, and they were not buying her pathetic defense. I stood my ground, letting her scream until her voice cracked. I looked at her with a calm, steady expression that completely terrified her. I told her she was absolutely delusional if she thought she still had any control over my life or bank accounts. I explained to her, and the 40,000 people watching the live broadcast, that I had known about her financial schemes for a very long time. I told her ever since I found out she stole my college fund to buy Kelsey a sports car, I had been quietly protecting myself. I knew she would try to sabotage my wedding day because she could never stand to see me happy or successful without her permission. So I did not just sign the standard vendor contracts when Gavin and I started planning this day 10 months ago. I told my mother I had sat down with Mr. Harrison and every caterer, florist, and musician to set up a specific security protocol. I revealed I had placed a strict master password on every single financial document and venue agreement. I told her no cancellations, no guest list changes, and absolutely no refund reroutes could be processed without that verbal password. My mother's face went completely blank. She stared at me as her brain tried to process what I had just said. She stammered, asking what I was talking about. I kept my voice perfectly level and explained exactly what happened when she sat in her sunroom at 6 o'clock this morning and hit send on those forged cancellation emails. She thought she was being a criminal mastermind by using her status as a secondary emergency contact to shut down the wedding. But I told her that because her emails did not contain my secure master password, the venue software immediately rejected her request. The $80,000 refund she was so desperately trying to steal was never actually processed. The money never even left my secure escrow account. Mr. Harrison and his team were legally bound to freeze the event schedule, but they were absolutely not authorized to move a single penny of my money to DeAndre Failing Law Firm. My mother had confidently told DeAndre the money was secured, but she was completely wrong. She had compromised her entire high society reputation and risked federal prison for a bank transfer that never even happened. DeAndre let out a loud, panicked gasp. He grabbed his own hair, looking like he was about to physically collapse onto the white rose petals. He realized he had exposed his firm to criminal liability for absolutely nothing. But the nightmare was not over for them. I took a step closer to my mother, making sure she could hear every single word clearly. I told her that the master password block did not just stop the refund, it triggered an automatic security protocol. I explained that when the venue system detected an unauthorized attempt to change the destination routing number to an unverified corporate account, it immediately flagged the transaction as a high-level security threat. It triggered a massive wire fraud alert directly with my primary bank. I told her that the bank fraud department had automatically locked down my accounts, logged the exact IP address from her sunroom computer, and generated a comprehensive incident report. They had a perfect digital footprint of her attempted crime. I told my mother that her arrogant attempt to steal my money had actually done all the hard work for the Attorney General. She had handed the state investigators a perfectly wrapped digital confession. The sheer magnitude of her epic failure finally crushed whatever toxic pride my mother had left. Her knees visibly buckled hard, and she had to grab the edge of the dining table to keep herself from falling onto the grass. She looked at the Attorney General standing calmly nearby, and then she looked at the thousands of people judging her through the camera lenses. She had spent her entire life carefully curating an image of extreme wealth, intelligence, and superiority. Now she was standing in a stolen white wedding dress, completely exposed as a desperate, incompetent criminal who could not even successfully forge an email. The crowd began to murmur, pointing and shaking their heads at the absolute pathetic state of my toxic family. I looked at Gavin, who gave me a proud, reassuring smile. We had completely disarmed them without ever raising our voices or losing our dignity. My mother thought she could use my beautiful wedding day to prove she owned me forever, but instead, she had just permanently locked herself in a financial and legal prison of her own making. DeAndre stood frozen on the manicured grass, his expensive leather shoes suddenly looking very heavy and entirely out of place. The routing number I had just read aloud echoed across the silent Botanical Gardens, hanging in the warm afternoon air like a death sentence. It was not just any random bank account. It was the primary corporate escrow account for his boutique law firm. In the legal world, an escrow account is absolutely sacred. It is heavily regulated and monitored by the federal government and the State Bar Association. Using it to receive stolen funds, especially funds acquired through forged digital documents, was not just a simple clerical error. It was a career-ending, catastrophic felony. I watched his chest heave as he struggled to pull oxygen into his lungs. The smug, confident corporate predator who had mocked my husband just minutes ago was completely gone. In his place stood a terrified, broken man, realizing he had just participated in a massive federal crime on a live internet broadcast. Josephine, the state attorney general, took another slow, deliberate step toward him. She did not raise her voice, but her tone was sharp enough to cut through solid glass. She looked at DeAndre with absolute disdain, reserved for arrogant men who think the law ignores them. She told him that as a practicing attorney, he knew exactly what the chain of custody meant for financial transactions. She calmly broke down the devastating reality of his situation for the 40,000 people watching online. Josephine explained that by providing his routing number to my mother, he conspired to launder $80,000 of stolen money. She told him that ignorance was absolutely not a valid legal defense, especially since he had personally called me an hour earlier to brag about his involvement. She reminded him that Gavin, my husband, who is an officer of the court, had heard DeAndre openly demand the signing of a property deed in exchange for letting the wedding continue. That phone call established clear, premeditated intent. DeAndre began to shake uncontrollably. He opened his mouth and tried to backpedal, stumbling over his words as he desperately tried to save his own skin. He pointed a trembling finger at my mother Brenda, who was still slumped in her chair. He practically screamed that he did not know she was going to forge my signature on the venue documents. He claimed he thought she had legitimate access to the funds and was simply transferring a family gift to help his business. He yelled that he was a respected corporate lawyer and he would never intentionally commit wire fraud. But his frantic excuses sounded incredibly hollow and pathetic, echoing across the massive pavilion. The local business owners in the crowd, who actually worked hard to build honest lives, simply crossed their arms and glared at him. They had zero sympathy for a wealthy bully caught in his own trap. Josephine did not even blink at his outburst. She simply tilted her head and delivered the most devastating psychological blow of the afternoon. She told DeAndre to stop embarrassing himself and look at the situation clearly. She pointed out that Richard and Brenda had not used their personal wealth to save his failing law firm. They had not liquidated stocks or sold their luxury cars. Instead, they forged documents to steal my money and directed those stolen funds straight into his professional bank account. Josephine calmly explained what that actually meant. She told DeAndre that his wealthy, sophisticated in-laws had just used him as a disposable financial mule. They had deliberately insulated themselves from the banking paper trail by making sure his name and his law firm were the ultimate destination for the fraudulent wire transfer. If the bank flagged the transaction, which it did, DeAndre would be the one holding the bag. The realization hit DeAndre with the brutal force of a freight train. He slowly turned his head to look at my parents. His eyes widened as the sheer magnitude of their betrayal finally registered in his mind. For years he had bent over backward to impress Richard and Brenda. He had bought expensive suits, leased imported sports cars, and projected an image of absolute perfection just to fit into their elite country club world. He had constantly mocked my non-profit work to earn my father approval. He thought he was the golden son they always wanted. But in reality, the moment things got tough, they had thrown him directly under the bus to protect their own assets. They did not respect him at all. They had used his desperate need for approval to turn him into the fall guy for a federal crime. DeAndre's face twisted into a mask of pure, unfiltered hatred as he stared at my father. Richard refused to make eye contact, staring stubbornly at the grass. My mother, Brenda, kept her face buried in her hands, completely ignoring the man she had just destroyed. Josephine let that heavy silence sink in before she delivered the final legal consequence. She spoke with the absolute authority of the state. She told DeAndre that he had permanently disgraced his profession. She informed him that her office would be officially notifying the State Bar Association first thing Monday morning. She promised him his legal license would be immediately suspended pending a full criminal investigation. DeAndre staggered backward as if physically struck. His knees buckled, dropping heavily onto the white rose petals, ruining his custom-tailored suit. He buried his face in his hands, letting out a loud, agonizing sob that echoed through the Botanical Gardens. His prestigious career, his massive ego, and his luxurious life were obliterated in a matter of minutes. He was a completely ruined man today. The absolute destruction of my toxic family was not quite finished, because right behind DeAndre, my sister Kelsey was finally realizing her perfect, comfortable life was evaporating, and she was about to make a desperate, selfish move. DeAndre was still kneeling on the white rose petals, weeping into his hands, when the heavy silence was shattered by a sharp, frantic gasp. It was my sister Kelsey. For her entire 30 years of life, Kelsey had been heavily shielded from every single consequence. She was the absolute golden child, the beautiful daughter who never did anything wrong and always got exactly what she wanted. My parents had spent decades cultivating her perfect life, buying her affection, and protecting her from the real world. But standing there in her expensive designer maternity dress, staring at the state attorney general and listening to the terrifying reality of federal wire fraud, Kelsey finally realized that her impenetrable bubble of privilege had just violently burst. She looked down at her husband crying on the ground, and instead of dropping to her knees to comfort the father of her children, she physically recoiled. She took 2 large steps backward, looking at DeAndre with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. Kelsey began to shake her hands aggressively, gripping her designer purse. She looked around at the hundreds of cell phones still recording every single second of the meltdown. She knew her wealthy country club friends were watching the live broadcast, and she knew she had to desperately distance herself from the sinking ship. Kelsey opened her mouth and unleashed a frantic, high-pitched scream that echoed across the pavilion. She pointed a manicured finger right at her husband's head and yelled that she had absolutely nothing to do with the stolen money. She threw DeAndre directly to the wolves without a single second of hesitation. She screamed to the crowd that DeAndre was a complete failure of a provider who was drowning in secret corporate debt. She told everyone that he was so absolutely desperate to pay for the extravagant $50,000 baby shower she demanded next month that he practically begged my mother to help him steal my wedding refund. She loudly exposed that their massive suburban house was weeks away from foreclosure and that DeAndre had been lying to her about his corporate success for the entire year. She called her own husband a pathetic broke loser right in front of the entire city. DeAndre stopped crying and looked up at his wife with an expression of absolute betrayal. The man who had just risked a 5-year federal prison sentence to fund her lavish lifestyle was now watching her publicly execute his remaining dignity. He stood up, his face red and tear-stained, and screamed right back at her. He yelled that she was a spoiled, ungrateful brat who threatened to divorce him every single time her credit card was declined. He told the crowd that Kelsey was the one who originally suggested targeting my nonprofit building because she was insanely jealous of my independence. Kelsey's face turned a violent shade of purple. Realizing her husband was taking her down with him, she immediately pivoted and turned her vicious rage onto the person who had created this entire mess. She lunged toward my mother Brenda, who was still sitting frozen in her ridiculous white wedding dress. Kelsey screamed that this was all Brenda's fault. She yelled that Brenda was a manipulative, toxic monster who forced them into this illegal scheme just to punish me for not inviting her wealthy friends to the wedding. My mother completely snapped. The woman who had spent her entire life worshipping the ground Kelsey walked on suddenly leaped out of her wooden chair with her teeth bared. Brenda screamed that she had sacrificed her entire existence to give Kelsey the perfect life and called her a treacherous, backstabbing little snake. She yelled that she should have never stolen my college fund to pay for Kelsey tuition because Kelsey ended up being a worthless trophy wife who married a criminal. That specific insult pushed my father Richard completely over the absolute edge. Richard grabbed my mother by the arm, shaking her and screaming that she had just permanently destroyed his pristine business reputation. He roared that his investment partners were watching this broadcast, and his entire corporate legacy was ruined because she was too stupid to forge an email correctly. Brenda screamed right back in his face, calling him an absent, miserable coward who only cared about his bank accounts and never actually loved any of them. The scene devolved into absolute pure chaos. The four of them stood in a tight circle on the manicured lawn, viciously tearing each other apart with decades of buried resentment. They screamed about secret bank accounts, hidden debts, infidelities, and petty jealousies. They completely forgot about me. They forgot about Gavin. They even forgot about the Attorney General, standing just a few feet away. The mask of the perfect high society family was entirely gone, replaced by four rabid animals viciously biting each other to survive. They threw every toxic secret they had ever kept right out into the open air, desperately trying to ruin each other before they could be ruined themselves. The ugly, horrifying reality of their conditional love was on full display for the entire world to witness. I stood perfectly still, watching the absolute destruction of the people who had tortured me for 33 years. I did not feel angry anymore. I did not even feel sad. I just felt an overwhelming sense of profound relief. I looked away from the screaming match and looked out at the massive crowd of 700 guests. The local business owners, the single mothers, the teenagers from my charity program, and the venue staff were all standing in dead absolute silence. Nobody was laughing anymore. The sheer disgust on their faces was palpable. They were witnessing the ultimate implosion of greedy, entitled people who thought money made them untouchable. Gavin wrapped both of his arms around my shoulders, pulling my back against his chest. He rested his chin on the top of my head, offering a silent physical reminder that I was completely safe. I looked at Gavin's parents who were watching the screaming match with quiet, sorrowful pity. They had tried to tell me for years that I was not the broken one in my family, but seeing it validated like this was surreal. My toxic family had spent my entire life trying to convince me that I was the problem, that I was the black sheep who was destined to fail without their guidance. But as I watched them violently destroy each other over money and pride, I finally understood the absolute truth. I was never the black sheep. I was simply the only person in the family who managed to escape the slaughterhouse. The vicious screaming match finally began to burn itself out. My mother Brenda and my father Richard stood panting on the lawn, looking like two completely hollow shells of the proud, wealthy socialites who had burst through those doors just an hour ago. DeAndre was still sobbing quietly into his hands, and Kelsey was glaring at all of them with venomous resentment. They had exhausted their decades of toxic ammunition, and now they were just standing there surrounded by 700 disgusted witnesses. I took a deep breath, feeling the cool afternoon breeze brush against my face. It was finally time to end this, completely and permanently. I let go of Gavin's hand and walked calmly toward my parents. As I moved forward, a tall, distinguished man with silver hair stepped out from the crowd to join me. This was Jonathan, the lead corporate counsel for my foundation. Jonathan had spent the last 10 years helping me navigate complex charity laws, and he had absolutely zero patience for greedy people trying to exploit his clients. He walked with a heavy, incredibly deliberate stride, standing firmly by my side, ready for action. Jonathan was holding a thick black leather clipboard. He did not introduce himself with a warm smile or offer a polite handshake to my parents. He simply stopped in front of my father, Richard, and shoved the heavy clipboard firmly against my father's chest, forcing him to take it. Richard looked down at the thick stack of legal documents attached to the board, his hands shaking so badly that the metal clip rattled loudly in the quiet pavilion. My mother, Brenda, leaned over to look at the papers, her eyes red and swollen from crying, real tears of absolute panic. She asked in a weak, trembling voice what this was. I did not let Jonathan answer, because this was my personal battle to finish. I looked directly into my mother's eyes and told her that she was currently holding her one and only exit strategy. I told her it was a legally binding settlement and a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement. I explained that she and my father were going to read it, sign it, and abide by every single word of it for the rest of their natural lives. Richard tried to summon a tiny fraction of his old authoritarian bravado. He puffed out his chest and told me he was not signing anything without his own attorney present. I laughed, a very quiet, completely humorless laugh. I told him he was absolutely welcome to call his attorney right now. I gestured toward Josephine, the Attorney General, who was standing nearby, watching him with cold, calculating eyes. I told my father that if he wanted to involve his personal lawyers, we would skip the civil settlement entirely and move straight into the federal wire fraud charges. I reminded him that I possessed the forged cancellation emails, the altered banking routing numbers, and the perfect digital footprint from his home network. I told him that if he refused to sign the paperwork on that clipboard, the massive manila folder of evidence would be sitting on the desk of the Federal Bureau of Investigation by Monday morning. My father's jaw snapped shut instantly. The tiny spark of defiance in his eyes completely died out, replaced by absolute sheer terror. He looked down at the clipboard, realizing he was completely trapped and defeated without any remaining options. I stepped closer, making sure my voice was crystal clear for them and the thousands of people still watching the live broadcast. I told them exactly what was in the agreement. I explained that the first page was a legally binding promissory note. I reminded them about a very specific incident that happened last winter. I told the crowd that exactly 14 months ago, my parents had fraudulently accessed my personal savings account and drained $15,000 without my permission. I revealed they had used my hard-earned money to completely fund the luxury nursery for Kelsey's first baby. At the time, they told me to stop being selfish and consider it my mandatory contribution to the growing family. They knew I would not press charges back then because I was still deeply trapped in their toxic web of guilt and obligation. But I told them today was the day the generational debt was officially called in. I demanded that the $15,000 be wired back into my personal account within exactly 48 hours, or the federal authorities would be adding grand larceny to their list of pending criminal charges. My mother let out a small, pathetic gasp, but I did not stop speaking. I pointed to the second section of the legal documents. I told them it was the most ironclad non-disclosure and no-contact agreement Jonathan had ever drafted in his entire legal career. I laid out the absolute boundaries with zero room for any misinterpretation. I told them that once they signed those papers, they were legally barred from ever speaking my name, Gavin name, or the name of my foundation in public or private. Ever again, I told them they were forbidden from ever attempting to contact us by phone, email, or through third-party relatives. I told them they were permanently banned from stepping within 1,000 feet of my home, my office, or any community event I was hosting. I looked directly at my mother, Brenda, and told her that she no longer had a daughter. I looked at my father Richard and told him that his legacy ended right here on this manicured grass. I promised them both with absolute unwavering certainty that if they ever broke a single clause of that agreement, the FBI would be knocking on their pristine suburban door before they could even blink their eyes. I watched the last arrogant remnants of their toxic empire completely crumble into absolute worthless dust right before my very own happy eyes today. My father Richard stood staring at the heavy black clipboard in his shaking hands. He looked at me and saw absolutely no mercy in my eyes. He looked at the Attorney General and saw the crushing weight of the state government ready to bury him. His authoritarian playbook had completely run out of pages, so he did what all desperate patriarchal bullies do when they lose control over the women in their lives. He turned to the nearest man and tried to strike a backroom deal. Richard shifted his focus away from me and looked directly at my husband Gavin. He mistakenly thought that because Gavin was a man, he would automatically side with the traditional hierarchy of the family. Richard actually tried to straighten his ruined posture, fixing his tie and putting on a fake expression of masculine solidarity. He took a step toward Gavin, completely ignoring me as if I were just an emotional child throwing a tantrum. He held his hands out in a pleading gesture, trying to look like a reasonable father. Richard lowered his voice, trying to sound calm and rational. He called Gavin's son and told him that they needed to handle this like logical men. He said that weddings are highly stressful events and that I was simply letting my emotions cloud my judgment. He actually had the absolute nerve to tell Gavin that as my new husband, it was his responsibility to step up and talk some sense into his wife before she completely destroyed the family legacy. Richard played the ultimate toxic family card. He looked Gavin right in the eye and said that blood is thicker than water. He pleaded with Gavin to understand that family fights happen, but you do not send your own parents to federal prison over a simple financial misunderstanding. He told Gavin that if he convinced me to drop the settlement and the non-disclosure agreement, Richard would personally make sure Gavin was accepted into the elite country clubs. He thought he could buy my husband loyalty with high society status. He begged Gavin to take the clipboard out of my lawyer hands and put an end to this public embarrassment before it ruined everyone. Gavin stood perfectly still, letting my father finish his pathetic, desperate speech. He did not look intimidated, and he did not look tempted. He just looked incredibly tired of dealing with this ridiculous man. Gavin took a slow, deliberate step forward, closing the distance between them. He did not raise his voice or puff out his chest like DeAndre had tried to do earlier. Gavin possessed the quiet, dangerous intensity of someone who spent his entire life fighting in the trenches of the justice system. He looked my father up and down with absolute clinical precision. Gavin told Richard to never ever call him son again. He told my father that the quote about blood being thicker than water was actually entirely wrong. He explained that the original ancient quote states that the blood of the covenant is thicker than the water of the womb, meaning that the bonds you choose to make are infinitely stronger than the people you just happen to be born to. Gavin said he chose me, and he would burn the entire world down before he ever let anyone hurt me again, let alone the people who were supposed to protect me. Then Gavin leaned in slightly, dropping his voice to a low, menacing register that only my parents and I could hear. He told Richard that he seemed to have a massive misunderstanding about what a public defender actually does every single day. Gavin explained that he did not just handle paperwork in a safe, clean office. He said he spent 40 hours a week standing shoulder to shoulder with actual hardened criminals. He dealt with gang members, violent offenders, and people who had absolutely nothing to lose. He looked Richard dead in the eye and told him that he was not a tough guy. He told Richard he was just a weak, pathetic narcissist hiding behind an expensive tailored suit and a fat bank account. Gavin painted a terrifying, vividly clear picture of reality. Without his country club memberships, he was completely defenseless. Gavin explicitly described what would happen to a soft, wealthy, arrogant man like Richard in the county jail holding cell while waiting for a federal wire fraud arraignment. He told him he would not last a single day behind bars before somebody broke him in half. My father's face turned the color of wet ash. The fake masculine solidarity completely vanished, leaving behind a terrified, trembling old man. He realized that Gavin saw right through his money and his status, straight down to the pathetic coward hiding underneath. Gavin reached out and firmly tapped the heavy black clipboard, still shaking in my father's hands. The papers he was holding were not a negotiation. They were a life raft, and the only reason he was being offered that raft was because my beautiful, incredible heart was still too kind to let him rot in a concrete cell. Gavin pulled a simple black pen out of his suit pocket and clicked it open. He held the pen out, suspending it in the empty space between them. He told my father to stop playing games, stop begging, and stop pretending he had any power left. He told Richard to take the pen, sign his name on the dotted line, and get out of our sight before he changed his mind and called the police himself. Richard stared at the black pen. He looked at the state attorney general, watching him with eager anticipation. He knew Gavin was absolutely right. He was completely out of options. With a shaking, sweaty hand, my father reached out and took the pen from my husband. He pressed the ink to the paper and finally surrendered his absolute control, forever, right there in front of the entire cheering crowd. My father, Richard, stared at the black ink on the paper as if it were poison. But the terrifying reality of a federal wire fraud indictment completely overpowered his massive ego. He pressed the tip of the pen to the signature line and hastily scribbled his name, surrendering his patriarchal authority forever. He did not look at me or Gavin as he shoved the heavy clipboard toward my mother. Brenda looked at the documents with wide, bloodshot eyes. The pristine white wedding dress she wore to steal my spotlight was now wrinkled and stained with dirt from the lawn. She looked up at me one last time, her lips trembling as she tried to form a word, perhaps an apology or a plea for mercy. But the absolute coldness in my eyes stopped her. She realized I was no longer her victim. She was staring at a stranger who held the keys to her freedom. With a loud, suffocating sob, she signed her name right beneath my father. Kelsey snatched the clipboard next. The golden child who had spent her entire life shielded from consequence aggressively scrawled her signature. She was terrified of losing her country club status and desperate to comply. Finally, the clipboard was tossed onto the grass in front of DeAndre. He was still kneeling, looking broken. He slowly picked up the pen and signed the non-disclosure agreement, sealing his own monumental downfall. The four of them had officially signed away their right to ever exist in my world again. Jonathan, my lead corporate counsel, stepped forward and calmly retrieved the clipboard from the grass. He did not rush. He took his time, meticulously inspecting each signature to ensure it was legally binding and properly dated. The absolute silence in the Botanical Gardens was deafening, broken only by the sound of Jonathan flipping the thick pages. After a few agonizing moments, he looked up and gave me a firm nod, confirming that the ironclad agreement was perfectly executed. He tucked the clipboard securely under his arm and stepped back into the crowd. Josephine, the state attorney general, gave DeAndre one final look of absolute professional disgust. She reminded him that her office would be moving forward with the State Bar Association on Monday morning, and that signing my civil agreement did not protect him from the professional consequences of his corporate malpractice. She turned her back on my toxic family, completely dismissing them from her presence. It was the ultimate display of power and boundaries. I looked at the four people who shared my blood and realized I felt absolutely nothing for them anymore. There was no lingering sadness and no residual anger. Just a profound, sweeping emptiness where my familial obligations used to be. I turned to Mr. Harrison, the venue director, who was standing near the edge of the dance floor. I gave him a small, polite smile and told him that these four individuals were no longer on the approved guest list. I asked him to please have his security team escort the trespassers off the private property immediately. Mr. Harrison immediately nodded, signaling to the four burly security guards stationed near the grand entrance. They marched across the manicured lawn, their heavy boots crunching against the white rose petals. They surrounded my parents, Kelsey and DeAndre, forming a tight, intimidating circle. The lead guard pointed directly toward the heavy iron gates and firmly instructed them to leave the premises. For a brief moment, my father looked like he wanted to argue. He puffed his chest instinctively, preparing to yell about his wealth and status. But then he looked past the guards and saw the massive crowd of 700 people. The single mothers, the local business owners, and the teenagers from my foundation were standing shoulder to shoulder, forming an impenetrable human wall behind me. Michelle, the investigative journalist, still had her smartphone raised, broadcasting their ultimate defeat to tens of thousands of local viewers. They were completely surrounded by a community that despised them. The harsh reality of their utter powerlessness finally broke them. DeAndre slowly stood up, brushing the dirt off his ruined custom suit, and looked at the ground. Kelsey hid her face behind her designer purse, sobbing hysterically as she realized her pristine social reputation was burning to ashes. My mother Brenda tried to hold her head high, but her shoulders slumped under the unbearable weight of her public exposure. They turned around and began the long, agonizing walk toward the exit. The walk of shame down the long white gravel path was the most satisfying moment of my entire life. When they had burst through those doors earlier, they marched like conquering royalty, expecting to crush my spirit and steal my assets. Now they were shuffling away like terrified criminals escorted by venue security, while 700 people watched them in absolute dead silence. Nobody booed, nobody threw insults. The total absence of sound was infinitely more powerful than any screaming match could ever be. The silent judgment of the community pressed down on them heavily with every single step they took. The cameras captured their pathetic retreat, immortalizing their failure for the entire city to see. I stood next to Gavin, feeling his strong, warm hand gripping mine tightly as we watched them walk further and further away. They reached the massive, heavy oak and iron doors at the edge of the Botanical Gardens. The security guards stepped aside and physically pushed the heavy doors open for them. My mother hesitated for one split second, looking back over her shoulder toward the beautifully decorated reception tent. But she did not see a daughter longing for her approval. She saw a strong, independent woman, surrounded by true love and immense power. She quickly turned her head away and stepped out into the parking lot. The security guards grabbed the thick iron handles and pulled the grand doors completely shut. The heavy doors shut, sealing them out forever. The heavy iron doors of the Botanical Gardens slammed shut with a deep, echoing thud that resonated through the very soles of my shoes. For a fraction of a second, the entire pavilion remained suspended in absolute, perfect silence. It was the kind of silence that follows a massive thunderstorm, breaking the quiet realization that the danger has finally passed. I stood next to Gavin, watching the empty pathway where my abusers had just walked away. Then somebody in the back of the crowd started clapping. It was a slow, steady rhythm that quickly caught fire, spreading rapidly across the manicured lawn. Within seconds, all 700 people erupted into a deafening, joyous roar. It was not the polite, restrained golf clap you hear at elite country club gatherings. It was a raw, thunderous celebration of pure liberation. People were cheering, whistling, and stomping their feet on the grass. The string quartet immediately picked up their bows and launched into a vibrant, upbeat melody that instantly lifted the heavy tension right out of the air. I felt a massive physical weight lift from my shoulders, a crushing burden I had been carrying since I was a little girl, completely evaporating into the warm afternoon breeze. The toxic fog of gaslighting and manipulation that had clouded my entire existence was suddenly gone, leaving behind a sky so incredibly clear and bright, I could hardly believe it was real. I took my first genuine breath of absolute freedom. Patricia and David Gavin, wonderful parents, were the first to reach us. Patricia had tears streaming down her smiling face as she pulled me into an incredibly fierce hug. She held my face in her hands and told me I was the strongest woman she had ever met. David wrapped his arms around both of us, telling Gavin how incredibly proud he was to call me his daughter. There were no conditions to their love, no secret agendas, and no financial ultimatums. They just loved me simply and completely. Suddenly, Jamal and a massive group of teenagers from my foundation mentorship program swarmed around us, jumping up and down with absolute excitement. One of the young girls, a high school senior I had tutored for 3 years, handed me a single white rose she had saved from the original floral arrangements. She looked at me with bright, shining eyes and thanked me for showing her what it actually means to stand up to bullies. I looked around the sea of smiling faces, seeing the local bakery owners, the single mothers, and the community center volunteers. My mother had tried to convince me that I was entirely alone in this world. She repeatedly told me that without her wealthy connections, I would be nothing. She was so incredibly wrong. I was standing in the exact center of a massive, vibrant universe, built entirely on mutual respect and genuine compassion. Mr. Harrison, the venue director, walked over with a massive grin on his face, carrying 2 crystal flutes filled with sparkling apple cider. He handed them to Gavin and me, completely dropping his professional nervous demeanor. He told us that in his 20 years of managing luxury events, he had never seen a more beautiful or deserving wedding reception. He gestured toward the massive buffet tents, where Roberto, the executive chef, and his incredible catering staff were currently rolling out massive trays of decadent desserts and fresh seafood. The staff had gone completely above and beyond, pulling out every single reserve ingredient they possessed, just to honor the people standing in that garden. The local business owners were mingling with the teenagers, sharing stories and laughing loudly. The atmosphere was incredibly light, buzzing with the kind of authentic joy you absolutely cannot buy with a trust fund. I took a sip of the sweet cider, leaning my head against Gavin's shoulder. We watched our chosen family feast and celebrate our new life together. Nobody cared about the ruined seating charts or the missing expensive wedding favors. They were just so incredibly happy to be there, sharing this beautiful victory with us. For the first time in my life, I did not have to monitor my behavior to please a demanding parent or shrink myself down to make my sister feel superior. I was allowed to simply exist and be celebrated. Gavin took the crystal flute from my hand, set it on a nearby table, and gently led me toward the center of the wooden dance floor. The string quartet smoothly transitioned into a slow, beautiful acoustic arrangement of our favorite song. As Gavin wrapped his strong arms around my waist and pulled me close, the rest of the world completely faded away. We swayed together under the warm afternoon sun, surrounded by the gentle rustling of the ancient oak trees. I rested my cheek against his chest, listening to the steady, calming rhythm of his heartbeat. For my entire 33 years of life, I had been desperately running on an endless emotional treadmill, trying to earn the love of a family who only saw me as a financial asset and a convenient scapegoat. I had believed the toxic lie that because we shared the same blood, I was permanently obligated to endure their disrespect, their manipulation, and their relentless cruelty. But as I danced with my incredible husband, I finally understood the absolute truth about boundaries. Setting a boundary is not an act of cruelty. It is the ultimate act of self-preservation. Walking away from my toxic family was not a loss. It was the greatest, most empowering victory of my entire life. I had finally broken the generational curse. I would never pass that toxic conditional love down to my own future children. Gavin spun me around the dance floor, and as I looked out at the 700 beautiful strangers who had become my true family, I felt an overwhelming sense of absolute peace. The empty room my mother had tried to use to break me had become the exact foundation where my real, beautiful life officially began. The most profound lesson I learned from the darkest morning of my life is that blood simply dictates biology, but it never ever dictates loyalty. Society conditions us to believe that we owe our families endless forgiveness simply because they raised us. We are taught to absorb their toxic behavior to keep the peace and to sacrifice our own mental health to protect their public image. But true love does not require you to sign away your boundaries, your assets, or your self-worth. If the people who are supposed to protect you become the very people you need protection from, you have every absolute right to walk away and never look back. Healing begins the exact moment you stop seeking validation from those who are committed to misunderstanding you. You possess the incredible power to completely rewrite your definition of family. When you finally remove the toxic individuals blocking your light, you create massive, beautiful space for the people who will actually celebrate your existence. My empty wedding venue was not a tragedy. It was the greatest gift I ever received because it forced me to fill my life with undeniable, authentic love. Have you ever had to draw a difficult line with toxic family members, or had to walk away from people who underestimated your true worth? I would love to hear your incredible stories of resilience in the comments below. If this journey resonated with your own experiences, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more authentic stories about taking back your power. Share this video with someone who might need a gentle reminder today that setting firm boundaries is not selfish, it is absolutely necessary. Thank you so much for listening, and remember that your chosen family is always out there waiting to celebrate exactly who you are.